Good evening. It's good to see you here tonight. You know where we're going. Open your Bibles to Joshua chapter 10. Joshua chapter 10 is where we're going to be. Last week, and just again, I'll kind of give you a little bit of a refresher every week just to prime the pump and get us back to where we are. I hope that you've been enjoying this. Again, we've just kind of been looking through this more expositorily, looking through the text and, not really having an agenda to go one place or another, but to go through chapter by chapter and see the culminating effect of faithfulness to God in really hard times. But I've told you this before, Joshua should be a movie. It should be multiple movies because it's incredible all the ways that God has continually showed up. And I think chapter 10, if you like Joshua, if you've read Joshua, whether before or just started reading it because we've been studying it, chapter 10 is an amazing book, or a chapter rather. God shows up in some really amazing ways, and some of the miracles that are described in Joshua 10 are awesome by themselves, but I think when you put them in their proper context, that's why we've already studied chapter 9, because remember last week we looked at their interaction with the Gibeonites, and you remember the Gibeonites came and presented themselves as this faraway people that are down on their luck and need this covenant, this peace treaty essentially with Israel. And remember what Joshua did or didn't do rather, right? He didn't consult God. He did agree to this. And so now they're kind of stuck. And so the Gibeonites end up getting assimilated almost into Israel. We're going to find an interesting detail more in chapter 10 and beyond. You'll realize that the Gibeonites are described as warriors, as mighty warriors. I think we get the impression from chapter 9, if we read that only, that they're this, lowly, people that were so fearful of what Israel might do that their only option is to come and basically deceive their way into safety. That while every other nation seemed to come about this from a military perspective. Now, you could say that and say, well, that's good strategy, and maybe you'd be right. But you'll find out that the Gibeonites are not slouches by their own standards. But now we're going to start seeing the Gibeonites are going to get under siege. They're going to get in trouble. And we're going to see how God intervenes. But one of the most amazing things, and I want to tell you this up front because I want this to start priming in your mind. What's incredible about this is that God does the miracles that he does. God is going to send essentially a hailstorm, but not just a hailstorm targeted only at this 5-king conglomerate that's going to come together to destroy not only the Gibeonites, but Joshua. God's going to do that. But then the story you're probably familiar with here is God pauses the sun in midair to give them additional time. And if you are going to force me to explain how that happens, I don't know. But we're going to read the text. We know that it does. But what's incredible to me about all of this is on the heels of a huge mistake. Right? Satan, the enemy, would love for when you and I make mistakes to come in our minds and say, you have dropped the ball big time. Right? How do you have the audacity to go back to God to ask for anything after you've just done fill in the blank? And maybe you have experienced feelings very similar to that of guilt and shame, and why should I be able to go back to God when I've failed? I think this story proves again and again that this is not how God operates, that God is still there in spite of mistakes. God is still there for his people over and over and over again because he's going to deliver them again and again. Let's read this together, and we're only going to read, it's a long chapter. Chapter 10 is one of the longest in Joshua, 43 verses long. We won't read the last, not quite half, but almost half. 29 through the end of the chapter we won't read. We'll summarize that. But I would like to read in chunks, 1 down through verse 28. Again, remember, this is all on the heels of the Gibeonites being assimilated in. And I want you to pay particular attention to Gilgal. That's the place remember, up to this point, we've not dove into every one of these details, but hopefully you've been reading at home. You know, Gilgal ends up kind of being their base of operations. This is the place where they continually go back to. They go out to war, and then they come back, right? They've celebrated the Passover there. The Gilgal ends up being the place of refocusing. It ends up being the place of renewal. It ends up being the place of safety. And I was reading a really great commentary, and we'll pick it out more as we keep going. But I want you to think about Gilgal in a lot of similar lights to the cross, right? The cross for Christians is where we should continually circle back around to, right? When we feel off our way, right? When we're not quite sure where to go, when we're not quite sure what to do as Christians, we can go back to the cross and start there and work our way back and know that we'll be on the right track. When we look at the cross first, it ends up being the North Star, right? Gilgal is kind of that for Israel and really kind of foreshadows a lot to the cross. But let's read this together. And again, we'll get our best to get through some of these names. These are all kind of some of these city-states within Canaan, within the Promised Land. And again, the Gibeonites have already been assimilated in, and now everybody else has heard this. So we'll start in verse 1. As soon as Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem. Now, if you think, Keaton, we're talking about Israel. Why is there a king in Jerusalem? Now, remember, what's going to happen is at this point, it's still a couple hundred years before, in fact, King David is going to be the king that is ultimately going to go and take back Jerusalem. They are going to conquer Jerusalem for all intents and purposes, but they're not going to live in Jerusalem. It's not going to be until David comes back and goes to Jerusalem, kind of connecting our morning and our evening lessons. That passage we looked at this morning of David devoting his resources is them going back to Jerusalem and rebuilding to get Jerusalem back to what it should be. Right? So at this point, other people are in Jerusalem, even though you would think Israel would be, but they aren't for right now. So king of Jerusalem heard how Joshua had captured Ai and devoted to its destruction, doing to Ai and its king as he had done to Jericho and its king. And now the inhabitants of Gibeon had made peace with Israel and were among them. He feared greatly because Gibeon was a great city, like one of the royal cities. And because it was greater than Ai, and all its men, notice this, were warriors. So Gibeon, again, just paint this picture. Gibeon was not this little lowly nothing state. They were not indefensible. They were warriors. But why, you might ask, why did they come and feel that they had to trick their way in? Because from their perspective, when they were looking and they were recognizing, they saw, they said, this God cannot be defeated. The Gibeonites, don't want to go to war with the God that has taken out Jericho, that has taken out Ai, and is now coming for everybody else, right? I don't want to go to war with those people in spite of our prowess, right? The Gibeonites, their prowess, they said, we've got cities, right? Objectively, they're being told their city is a great one. In fact, it's being described as a royal city, which probably meant that it was similar to how Charlotte is a regionally large city. That's probably what they meant by one of the royal cities. Gibeon was probably large even for its area, and they probably had control of other smaller territories that were around it. We learned that their warriors were strong. But they look at God, they look at Israel, and they have heard through the grapevine what all God has done, and they say that God cannot be defeated. And so instead of fighting, we're going to go and we're going to do this other. We still serve that same God. Let's continue reading. Verse 3. So Adoni-Zedek, king of Jerusalem, sent to Hoam, king of Hebron, to Piram, king of Jarmuth, to Japhia, king of Lamish, and to Debir, king of Eglon, saying, come up to me and help me. Let us strike Gibeon. For it has made peace with Joshua and with the people of Israel. So again, put yourself in their shoes. Gibeon, being a relatively important place within this geographical context, has been, for all intents and purposes, taken over, right? They didn't do it militarily, but Joshua has assimilated Gibeon and its people into Israel. And so now the remaining kings are now coming together and saying, listen, we might not be able to fight God individually. We might not be able to fight Joshua individually, but what if we come together and we're going to go strike Gibeon and we're going to go strike Joshua and we're going to take back all of the things? But of course, God's got other plans, and God's looking at this opportunistically and saying, hey, and Joshua's going to outright say this. He's going to say, we're going to have to fight all of these kings individually at some point, but now they've all willingly come together. And so God's going to utilize, again, God is going to utilize a great opportunity on the heels of a great mistake, ultimately to point back to God's glory. And again, we look at this and we might think, well, there's so much nuance here that's not conducive to our life. But I'm going to suggest to you that there's a lot more here that parallels over to our life than doesn't. And I'd challenge you to look into this, because so many times that's our context. Right? We have opportunities that are presented before us, and they come on the heels of great mistakes. You and I make mistakes daily. And we think to ourselves, Satan puts into our mind, that's not for you, right? You're already disqualified. You're already on the sidelines. You've already fumbled the ball. But God looks at this and says, I'm going to ultimately be glorified in spite of the mistake. And that's not God being easy on sin, but that is to say that God's grace is greater. God's mercy is greater than the mistakes, and that God will continually come in and forgive. Now, again, there was punishment. There was consequence. That's still true now, right? There are consequences for sin. But that doesn't mean that just because we make them, that disqualifies us from the mercy and love of God. It doesn't mean that we get sidelined forever. It means that God's able to step in. And so again, think about all that as we continue to read down through this. Okay, so verse 6, the men of Gibeon sent to Joshua at the camp at Gilgal, saying, don't relax your hand from your servants. Come up to us quickly and save us and help us. For all the king of the Amorites who dwell in the hill country have gathered against us. So remember, Gilgal is their center base. That's where they're continually going out of. Metaphorically, paralleling, we see the cross here. Joshua went up from Gilgal, he and all the people of war with him, and all the mighty men of valor. And the Lord said to Joshua, notice this, do not fear them, for I have given them into your hands. Not a man of them shall stand before you. Joshua 10 could be summarized a lot of ways, but one of the great points of this is that God can continually defy the odds. That in spite of what our mind says, in spite of what our heart says, in spite of what Satan would love to feed into our psyche, God is able to do abundantly more than we can ever think about. Now, that's not to say that he always steps in as literally as he does here. But again, sometimes we're going to look at this in a moment when God pauses the sun, and critics, even Christian critics, look at that and say, I don't know how to explain the fact that essentially God extended one day into two. The Hebrew word for pause doesn't literally mean the sun just stopped. What it means is it slowed down. So more than likely what God did was slowed the sun's rising and setting so that one day essentially became two. But again, as Christians, you and I should have no problem with that if we believe Genesis 1. If we believe Genesis 1, that God created the heavens and the earth, that God put all of this into existence, then there is no part of his creation that he should not have the ability to alter. He should have no problem pausing, adjusting, and that's not with outside the bounds of what he's capable of. Any creation that is bigger than its creator is a fallacy, right? And God is certainly not smaller than the creation that he made. So again, I don't know how he ends up pausing the sun. I don't know how he sends targeted hailstorms. I don't know. But I trust that the God that created you and me, and that created the sun and created the moon, that created the seasons that we experience now, that created everything that we see, has perfectly within his foresight to be able to pause the sun in any way that he pleases, because that's how big God is. And clearly Joshua believed that as well. Don't fear, for I have given them into your hands. Again, the subtext here. In spite of what your eyes may see, in spite of the fact that it's one king versus 5, besides the fact that this doesn't seem possible, don't fear. Not a man of them shall stand before you. So Joshua came upon them suddenly, having marched all night from Gilgal. Now again, you might look at that and say, Keaton, why? And this is primarily sermon, but I'm going to make this a little interactive here. Why would Joshua have had them march all night? It makes zero tactical sense. Why, when you have an army of 1 versus an army of collective 5, why would you march your army all night to only arrive tired, wore out, and you're supposed to fight an army how many X your size? Why would he do that? Why would Joshua march at night knowing full well that he's going to arrive tired? It doesn't make tactical sense, so why would he do it? It shows the power of God. To me, it's because he believed, verse 8, when God says, do not fear, Joshua takes him at his word. And again, this is inference, but Keaton's inferred this a couple times, and I'll continue to infer this. Joshua seems to have gotten the message that before he makes decisions, he should go to God in prayer, right? Because some of the responses that we get from God, again, verse 8, you tell me if I'm wrong, but as I read this, it sounds like a response. It reads like a response. It reads as if Joshua has come to God and say, Lord, this doesn't make any sense. This is 5 proper armies. These are kings that want me dead, that want your kingdom gone. Why should I go and save the Gibeonites? Why should I do this? And God comes back and says, don't fear, because I've given them into your hands. Now, the first miracle that happens in chapter 10 happens in verse 10. And I encourage you to mark all these because it's incredible the way God plays this out. So they marched all night. Again, tactically doesn't make sense, but as Marcy pointed out, I think it's Joshua's faith. Joshua will not lose based on unfaithfulness to God, right? If God chooses to deliver Israel up, that's one thing. But Joshua says, I'm not going to have faith be the problem again. I'm not going to have failure happen because I didn't go to God. God says, don't fear. And so the Lord tells us explicitly, verse 10, the Lord threw them into a panic before Israel, who struck them with a great blow at Gibeon and chased them by the way of the ascent at Beth Horon and struck them as far as Ezekiah and Makkedah. And as they fled before Israel, while they were going down the ascent of Beth Horon, the Lord drew down large stones from heaven on them as far as Achaia, and they died. There were more who died because of the hailstones than the sons of Israel killed with the sword. So we see God delivering Israel 2 ways already with a miracle, and he's got a third one up his sleeve that's really going to be the ringer that most of us are familiar with, and which even the little subheading within Joshua 10. He puts a panic on all of the other kingdoms. All the other armies are literally frenzying. Again, use your mind's eye to imagine this because I don't know logistically how it happened. But God made them so panicked that the original language tells us that they were bewildered, that they were so upset that they could not be consoled, right? Then he sends targeted hailstorms. We know that because we continue to look down. And the Lord threw down large hailstones from heaven as far as Achaia, and they died. And there were more who died because of the hailstones than the sons of Israel. So clearly, it was just going towards the enemy armies, right? Israel didn't lose any people because of the hailstones, but they did. Let's keep reading. We'll pick up in verse 12, and then verse 13 is really where we start kicking in. Now notice this. This is what gives me further confidence that he is praying to God all along. At that same time, Joshua spoke to the Lord in the day when the Lord gave the Amorites over to the sons of Israel, and he said in the sight of Israel, sun, stand still at Gibeon, the moon in the valley of Ajalon. And the sun stood still, and the moon stopped until the nation of Israel took vengeance on its enemies. Is this not written in the book of Jashar? The sun stopped in the midst of heaven and did not hurry to set for about a whole day. There's not been a day like it before or since when the Lord heeded the voice of man, for the Lord fought for Israel. The Lord fought for his people. And again, we look at this and you might say, Keaton, that's the Old Testament. There's a lot about nuance of the Old Testament that did not carry over to the New Covenant, and no argument with you. But when I look at the character of God, which is unchanging, and when we look at when it tells us that God fought for his people, and again, you see so many similarities, I see so many parallels with this and temptation and sin, right? Satan continually comes to us and says, look at your failure. God continually comes and says, in spite of that failure, you're still my child. I will still fight for you. I'll still be with you, right? And then it tells us that he fights for his people. I hope that you will underline that verse in your Bible, Joshua 10 and verse 14. There has been no day like it. The Lord heeded the voice of man, for the Lord fought for Israel. And I have in parentheses of all of my Bibles, Israel is the translation. But I want you to look at what's really being said, right? The letter of the law is talking about Israel. The context of this is talking about Israel. But Israel in that context is God's people. Those are his children. Those are the people that he loves, that he's fighting to protect. You and I, New Testament scripture tells us that if we're Christians, you and I are a new covenant. We're a royal priesthood. We're a treasured possession. We have the inheritance with Christ. We are co-heirs with Christ. And so we look at this and say, Israel in the Old Testament certainly, but God fights for his people. Friends, that's you and me. Today, that's you and me, the children that love him. So Joshua returned, verse 15. So Joshua returned with all of Israel to the camp at Gilgal again. And just as a little fun exercise, if you like to journal, if you like to annotate through your Bible, I'd encourage you in Joshua 10, underline all the instances of Gilgal. Really, go back to chapter 1 and work your way up and underline all these little references to Gilgal. Because again, there's so much parallel between this and New Testament, the cross, right? Again, this is the place we revert back to. This is the place that we come to recalibrate. This is the place we come to get resettled. This is the place we come. We did this morning, right? We take the Lord's Supper because the cross matters. This is a place of remembrance. It was for them. Right, they celebrated the Passover there. This was a place of memory. It was a place of importance. Right, they're going to stay at these various spots for a short time, but they're going to go back to Gilgal. And just to prove that point to you, jump ahead to the very end of the chapter. After all this takes place, tons of fighting. Joshua is going to go head to head with all of these kings and go back to their cities and take them over. We don't know the exact amount of time, but it takes a while. But go down to verse 43. Then Joshua returned and all of Israel with him to the camp at Gilgal. All of these great cities, all of these fortified nations that were being torn down. And at the end of the day, Joshua says, I'm going to go back to Gilgal. I'm going to go back to the place of memory. I'm going to go back to the place of remembrance. Is the cross that for you and me? I hope so. Or is the cross an afterthought? Right? Do we want the blessings of the cross without the remembrance of the cross? And that's a question that each of us have to wrestle with. Right? We want the blessings of it. We want the forgiveness of the cross. We want the mercy and the grace and the love that comes from the cross. Right? That's the great juxtaposition of the cross, is it's death and it's torture and it's mutilation. But what comes on the other side of it is freedom and it's forgiveness and it's mercy and it's grace. And we want the byproducts of it without oftentimes remembering the heavy stuff. Right? That's Gilgal. That's their place of Gilgal. Jump to verse 16, and this is going to be our last section, and then we'll wrap up for the evening. So at this point, the 5 Amorite kings, so these are the 5 individual, again, they're kind of collectively the Amorites, but they all have their individual little city-states and things like this we read all through. And there's some nuance here that I will summarize 29 down through verse 43, because that basically is just a record of them going to each of these individual cities. And it's going to say, that Joshua and the nation of Israel went to fill in the blank, and they destroyed that city, right? They killed the king, and then they came back, and they did it again, and they came back, and they kept coming back to Makkedah, and then they'd go out again. But let's start in verse 16. These 5 kings fled and hid themselves in the cave at Makkedah. And it was told to Joshua, the 5 kings have been found, hidden in the cave at Makkedah. And Joshua said, roll large stones against the mouth of the cave and set men by to guard it. But don't stay there. Pursue your enemies. Attack the rear guard. Do not let them enter the cities, for the Lord your God has given them into your hand. What he's saying is, okay, roll those stones over. We need to deal with the kings at some point. But right now, God has given us the armies into our hands. Right now, God has told us explicitly. Again, Joshua's not going to be caught holding the bag again. He said, God has told me explicitly, these armies have to go. There is no better time, right? They're all collectively together. We're going to go take them out now. We'll deal with the kings in a moment, and they do, right? They're going to go back, and they're going to roll the stones away, and they're going to actually come out, and Joshua's going to pull these people out, and he's going to bring the chiefs of his army up, and he's going to say, look, put your foot on their necks, right? And which is almost universal imagery for control. And he says, God is in control of all of this. This is one great exercise to prove that the God of Israel is here. In spite of what it may look like, the God of Israel is here. He says, roll the stones over the mouth of the cave, set men to guard it, but then you come back. Let's pursue our enemies. And Joshua and the sons of Israel had finished striking them with a great blow until they were wiped out. And then a remnant that remained of them had entered the fortified cities. And all the people returned safe to Joshua in the camp at Makkedah. Not a man moved his tongue against any of the people of Israel. Joshua said, open the mouth of the cave and bring those 5 kings out to me from the cave. And they did so. And they brought out the 5 kings to him, from the king of Jerusalem, the king of Hebron, the king of Jarmuth, the king of Lachish, and the king of Eglon. And they brought those kings out to Joshua, and Joshua summoned all the men of Israel and said to the chiefs of the men of war who had gone with him, come near and put your feet on the neck of these kings. And they came near and they put their feet on the necks. And Joshua said, don't be afraid or dismayed. Be strong and courageous. For thus the Lord will do to all your enemies against whom you fight. And afterwards Joshua struck them and put them to death. And he hung them on 5 trees, and they hung on the trees until evening. Now I want you to process what just happened, because you might be tempted to look at this and say, but Keaton, that is harsh, right? Why is God okay with these kings being killed, right? Well, this was the area that they were in. Why is Israel allowed to come take this? And I want you to recognize, I want you to put this in proper place here, because again, there's more foreshadowing. Just as Gilgal kind of points us to the cross. When we look at these kings, you recognize these are pagan kings that want nothing to do. They are diametrically opposed to the law and the will of God. And you look at this and you can make a pretty clear connection over that these kings very much are like sin. Right? Sin in our lives are things that separate us, that oppose the will of God. Right? And you look at that and you might think, well, Keaton, why does it have to be so harsh? Right? The Gibeonites, they were assimilated in. Why did they have to die? And I revert you back to the reading that Zach read for us this morning. Right? If our eye causes us to sin, it has to go. It can't be, any part of it can't be left. Because it would be better for us to go in without one eye or without a foot or without an arm to get into eternal reward than to have all of our parts and then be left to eternal torment. And that's the way God views enemies. Again, this is not malice. This is not hatred. This is not bias. This is simply God assessing these kings and says, they are diametrically opposed to my will. And remember, this is where God and us are different. Right? God is perfectly just. God doesn't have vengeance. God doesn't have retribution. God doesn't have spite. God looks at this and says, you're either against my will or you're with it. right? You and I allow our own feelings, our own temptations, all the bias to creep in. That's why we can't make the same choices. But God looks at this and is perfectly just and says, these are against me. And if it's against me, if it's against my perfect will, it has to be put out. It has to be put out in its entirety. And that means death, right? Is that not how we handle sin? Is that not how we should handle sin? When there are things in our lives that are opposed to God's will, do we come at it gingerly? We may, but we shouldn't. Or do we come at it with the full ferocity of God and say, this cannot be? Sinful temptation cannot coexist with the will of God. And that's the same way God views these kings that are so against what he would have them to do. He struck them to death and he hung them on 5 trees, verse 27. And at the time of the going down of the sun, Joshua commanded, and they took down from the trees and threw them into the cave where they had hidden themselves, and they put large stones against the mouth of the cave where they remain to this day. As for Makkedah, Joshua captured it on that day and struck it and its king with the edge of the sword. He devoted to destruction every person in it, and he left none remaining. And he did to the king of Makkedah just as he had done to the king of Jericho. And then you look at verse 29 and you go down through verse 43, and it's basically the same, right? Joshua and all of Israel had passed on to Libnah, to Lanish, and laid siege to it and fought against it. The Lord gave it into the hands of Israel. He captured it on the second day, struck it with the edge of the sword, every person in it, just as he had done at the kingdoms before. And that's the pattern for about 10 verses. But again, I want to circle back around. I've read it once and I want to reread it. Verse 43, I hope you'll note it in your Bible. Joshua returned and all of Israel with him to the camp at Gilgal. Friends, he returned to the cross. He returned to the memory. He returned to that place, that hub. Friends, do you and I have that? And you might think, and you might look and say, Keaton, I'm a Christian. Of course the cross means something to me. But notice that's not what I asked, right? All of us have to engage at some point with the cross if we're Christians, right? We have to reconcile the cross in our minds. The cross has to mean something, or baptism is just a bath, right? The cross has to mean something. But there's a difference between the cross meaning something at baptism and the cross being the place that we continually return to, right? Is the cross something that you engaged with at one point that's kind of become an afterthought? Or is the cross your Gilgal, the place when everything goes great or it goes south, that you're going to return back to that place? That's the place of memory. That's the place of respect. That's the place of worship, right? The cross should be that for you and me. Tonight, if you aren't a Christian, we want to extend that invitation anytime we're here. Joshua 10 is one of my favorite chapters in the book of Joshua. Again, God does miraculous things. But I'll phrase it this way again. Remember, miracles, and very much this is miraculous, right? It's above and beyond the laws of nature. But recognize that it's miraculous for our benefit. But everything that God did here was very much within the confines of God's being. Right, God stopping the sun, God sending a hailstorm, God causing confusion. All of that is within the bounds of what is natural for God because God created it all. So yes, it's a miracle by our standards, but it's very much within God's power by his, right? They returned to Gilgal because that's home. And you and I have that opportunity as Christians to go into the waters of baptism and come back to the cross to do that. If you've never put Christ on in baptism, we want to give you that opportunity. If we can help you with anything else, come let us know.